This is an India Today exclusive. I'm being joined by US Congressman Scott Perry, who is of the Republican Party, but also a key member of the House Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nuclear Non-Proliferation. Many thanks for joining us, Congressman Perry. Your first and foremost moves that we've seen in the recent past has to do with, specifically to do with China. Now, in terms of legislations, actions against China in the wake of and on the backdrop of coronavirus pandemic, what are you planning on doing, and what are the legislations that you've come up with?
Well, first of all, China, this is where the pandemic emanated from, and we may never know whether it happened accidentally or whether it was being produced in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We may never know that, but what we do absolutely know is that it came from this region of China, number one. Number two, they knew about it and did very little to alert the rest of the world. And number three, they have been less than cooperative with the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, in trying to learn about it, trying to contain it, and trying to minimize the effects of it, such that it has now traveled around the world and affected the world dramatically in a very negative way. And so what that has done is that has alerted many of the American people who before this thought that China was just a competitor of the United States, understanding that there are a lot of Chinese people in America, and we love them as our neighbors and friends, but there's a distinction between the Chinese people oftentimes and the Chinese Communist Party. And what Americans are waking up to now is that the Chinese Communist Party is an adversary of the United States and quite literally of the free world. And so our legislation kind of gets to that point, the fact that China is now, they are not honoring their agreement in Hong Kong. They are trying to take over, as you know, Tibet, and have been trying to do that for a long time. So we would like to recognize Tibet as its own free, autonomous country, autonomous entity. The same thing with Hong Kong. So I have pieces of legislation regarding that. We would also like the United States to take a more strong role in the World Health Organization. We pay a lot of money to the World Health Organization, but we don't get a lot in return in the way of verifiable, useful information, because it's propaganda from China. And as long as that's the case, we want to minimize America's role in paying for the World Health Organization. So there are three bills right there that we want to send the signal to China and the Communist Party in China. Either change your ways, or things are going to change dramatically with your relationship with the United States and with the rest of the free world.
Well, let's just take one legislation at one time. Let's start and begin with the most important one, to do with coronavirus and the role of the World Health Organization. What is it that you're looking at in that bill, and what is the kind of action that you expect your own administration to carry out against either China or the World Health Organization?
First of all, we would stop funding. We would suspend all funds to the World Health Organizations until they change the leadership, especially at the top. As you know, the leader of the World Health Organization has been a mouthpiece for China, parroting their communist propaganda and minimizing their role in the spread of the coronavirus around the world. This is simply unacceptable. And so we're demanding changes not only in the leadership, the physical, literal people leading the World Health Organization, but also in process. We want to see a more legitimate rollout of the World Health Organization that reflects the reality of the circumstance, not just what China would like people to believe. And until such time, our bill says that no more U.S. funding, no U.S. tax dollars go to the World Health Organization until that happens.
Well, Congressman Perry, there's a 30-day notice that President Trump has put WHO on. Are we looking at strengthening the probe that Dr. Tedros has ordered, looking at some action on that front, or is it Dr. Tedros has to step down, else there is going to be no funding?
Dr. Tedros has to leave. He's just been compromised. It is clear and we just have to move on. So that's a minimum standard. And of course, this legislation would codify in law what President Trump has already done. So he can take executive action as the executive in America, and that's fine. But we want to say that the United States Congress and the American people stand in solidarity with the president and his actions, and that's what this legislation does. So it essentially puts into law what the president has already put in place himself, but it puts it into law so that we're all operating on the same page. We're all operating in solidarity as Americans.
Right. The legislation that you have come up with on Tibet. Now, that's a very interesting one. It's a masterstroke in many ways than one, because the most sensitive issues for China is to do with territory. In that,
Yes.
You've come out with asking the US to recognize Tibet as an independent state. But we're also given to understand that your bill calls it Tibet Autonomous Region, something that the government in exile, the Tibetan government in exile over here, might not accept. Are you looking at changing that one? And then let's talk about the bill.
We're interested in moving that legislation, but we're certainly open to ideas, whether it's territory or difference in verbiage. But it has long been my opinion that the United States should recognize the Tibetan government in exile, and that we should have a mission. We should have a diplomatic mission in Lhasa to let the Chinese Communist government know that we do not accept their simply assimilating the Tibetan culture and the Tibetan territory into China. That is not acceptable. This whole might makes it right paradigm that the Chinese Communist Party uses. They're bigger, they're stronger, so they can just take over. That's something from the 18th century. That's how things were done in the past. That is not acceptable under current terms. And so I think it's important that the United States use its leverage to let China know that this is not acceptable, and that we're going to stand on the side of free people that want to determine their own destiny, whether they're Chinese, whether they're Tibetan, whether they're Taiwanese. That is our position as the United States of America. And so I've offered these precepts in the past. It's in legislative language now, and we're hoping to get some action on it. But we're certainly willing to have a conversation about the competing interest and different viewpoints on Tibet. Certainly willing to have that conversation.
Right. I was speaking to Congressman Ted Yoho a day earlier, and he said that the Foreign Relations Committee, in all probability, would be looking at co-sponsoring your bill on Tibet. Now, how does that move forward from there? What happens? Do you think there will be enough strength and support for the bill?
Well, it's hard to say right now. There seems to be a lot of support in Congress. There habitually has been a lot of support for Tibet, but it has never materialized in legislation that made it through the committee. And so now, but with the coronavirus again, and people's awareness of what the Communist Party in China has been doing, it might not be directly related to Tibet, but it's a leverage point. And so we have to find obviously a number of co-sponsors that are willing to co-sponsor it, and then get the chairman of the committee to schedule it for a hearing and a vote. And if he does, then we'll have to see whether there's enough support for doing something like this. I sure hope there would be. This is to me it's not a costly issue, and it sends a very strong signal to China. But I think we have to send strong signals to China. As you know, China's making moves right now on territory to its east and to its west, literally in India as well. And as long as China is continued to allow to do that, they are going to continue to do that. And so at some point, the forces of democracy and freedom have to stand together and say enough is enough, and we're going to take these measures. So this is one of many measures that can be taken, but it is one important one.
Well, interestingly, you mentioned India. We will be getting to that. But before that, you also mentioned cost. Now, in terms of cost, whether if a legislation will cost America or the world or not is something that we'll see later. But when it comes to China playing a role in the global economy, how do you see China being removed from that huge global supply chain? What are the kind of sanctions that US is contemplating? How can you sanction China to contain its aggressive posturing in the region and in the world?
Well, as you know, there are already tariffs on China, and there are going to be more considered. I talked to the deputy at the State Department on a phone call just earlier this week, where we're considering, as you know, Hong Kong is losing its certification for autonomy, and so sanctions are on the table. We're hoping, at least at the State Department, that the loss of the certificate for Hong Kong will inform the Chinese Communist Party that they've gone too far and they might pull back. But if they don't, the full range of sanctions are on the table for China at large. And I would imagine they would include the things that they already do, but also more specific things. Anything to do with national security certainly is on the table. But I think they might even go further to individual members of the Communist Chinese Party that profit from their agreements and their business with America in particular. That's the one thing we can certainly control. And the theft of intellectual property that can be attributed to individuals. And I have long thought that broad-based tariffs, while they hurt China, they also hurt America and the free world in general as well. And so it'd be much more effective to sanction certain individuals in China that are involved in the Communist Chinese Party and these actions. And I've expressed that viewpoint on many occasions. So I expressed it again. I hope that that's on the list of considerations. But I will tell you that China is going to continue to be a strong economic actor and competitor in the world, and it should be. But there are certain things that China cannot be involved in, at least from the perspective of the United States, and that's anything involved with national security, those kind of things. Whether it's telecommunications, whether it's medicine. We are very sensitive now to the supply chain issues regarding the COVID-19 response and the literal response from China that said that they were considering using that supply chain or imperiling that supply chain to weaken the United States and our ability to respond to the pandemic. That is unacceptable in the community of free nations. And so when it comes to those things, I think you're going to see America pulling that supply chain for national security, maybe for agriculture, for technology, for healthcare, back to the United States or to more trusted partners in the region, India being one of them.
Well, that's a very important point that you make. That India could be the next destination for the United States of America and American companies. Is my understanding right of what you just said?
Yes, to me, we should have been working on. We should continue to work on strengthening our ties and our relationship with India. As you know, India is the largest democracy on the planet. We have very much in common. Nothing's perfect, but we have much in common. So right now, even though a lot of our pharmaceuticals come from India, but the raw products, the raw material come from China, and so China still holds that leverage over us. So what we would like to do at a minimum is move that raw material supply chain out of China, whether that moves to India directly. Some of it can move to America, some to other places. It remains to be seen. But I think it's an important conversation that we absolutely need to have. And of course, what we need to have is a give and take, a trusting relationship where we know that there will be transparency, and that when we get into difficulties like we have with this pandemic, that we can count on our partners to be there with us. Not use it as a leverage point to weaken us, which is what China has doing. And so we're looking for a very, very different relationship than the one we have currently with the Communist Party in China.
You said that there's a specific list of individuals or companies in China that you're looking at, that the US is looking at sanctioning to ensure China is contained. Is there a list? Are there names that the committee has that you have to zero in on or to begin with?
I'm not. Let me be clear. I didn't say that the United States government was offering that. I said that I offered that.
Yes.
That should be a more targeted solution. I don't want to give the list. We do have a list. Obviously, we know who these people are, but I think it's improper right now to offer any of those names, because that would be a State Department action that would have to be vetted through all of the associated agencies to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences. But we absolutely know who the bad actors are in the Chinese Communist Party, and we can target our punishment, so to speak, to those individuals. And I think that can be very effective, because as in many places, they are driven by their profits. And when their profits are imperiled, that has a tendency to change behavior.
On Taiwan, how is it and why is it that the United States of America was not able to get Taiwan in on one of the most important events and meets to do with global health pandemic, and that's the World Health Assembly?
It's because here again, this is the World Health Organization. This is one of the things that absolutely must change. Taiwan is not included. Taiwan needs to be included. We have a bill, as you know, to include them and to literally be the representative from that region. They are a trusted partner. They are transparent, and they are more like the United States than the Chinese Communist Party by far. And so that is one of the pieces of legislation that we've offered to rectify that situation. If we look at the experience of Taiwan vis-a-vis China, we can see, as it relates to this pandemic, a very different experience, and one that is very much more responsible in dealing with the rest of the world. And so why would we continue to work with the Communist Party of China through the World Health Organization if we know that they cannot trust them? They imperil our citizens, and they imperil the lives and livelihoods of free world around the globe. And so that's the legislation we've offered. It is simply unacceptable to deal with the Communist Chinese Party, whether it's directly in this because they are untrustworthy, or whether it's through the World Health Organization. And those are the things that we're seeking to change.
Congressman Perry, given your military background, just the fact that China has opened up so many fronts, be it India, South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the changes that they're making, what is your reading of why they have opened so many fronts, and not just economically, but militarily as well?
Well, it goes to their overall strategy. If and this is not a secret. This was published, I think, in 1997. Their strategy to be not only the regional hegemon, but to be the dominant power around the globe. And so they published this strategy, whether it's militarily, whether it's economically, whether it's what they call the Thousand Talents program, or cultural changes where they take over places like Tibet, you name it. This is all part of their grand strategy to be the dominant global power. And the problem with that, of course, is that it is a communist, it is a totalitarian power that oppresses freedom, free thought, free thinking, free enterprise, and it simply cannot be allowed to stand. So we've known it's been out there, but there are a few people that have taken it seriously until the last, essentially since the election of President Donald J. Trump and his acknowledgement and actions regarding what many people in Washington, D.C., around the United States had been frustrated watching our government kind of play into this. We have had enough of it, and it's been led by President Trump and his actions.
Well, now coming to, again, military front being opened here in our neighborhood, the India-China border tensions. What's the reading in the United States of America of why China is doing it, and what could have led to China opening up the front over here with India as well?
It's again part of their overall strategy, but it keeps the rest of the free world kind of off balance. There are so many different competing interests. You're dealing with the pandemic at the same time you're dealing with diplomatic relations in the South China Sea, and now you have to deal with this incursion of China on its eastern border into India, and it's just all this becomes overwhelming. And of course, this sets the conditions for which they'll negotiate. So if you have a long list of things to negotiate from as opposed to a short list, once the negotiation starts, you're apt, if you have a big list, to come up with more things for on your side. And so I think that's part of their strategy, is to overwhelm their competition. And then if it does go to the negotiating table, they will end up with more than they would if they just stuck with one very finite focus. They have a whole range of things that they can negotiate on, and it ends up putting China more in the driver's seat. Again, this is their strategy to be the global dominant power.
But there's a slight difference in how India views it and how the US views it in terms of resolving it. Now, we know that President Trump offered to mediate. He also spoke of a conversation that he had with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which has been denied by the Indian administration. But having said that, India continues to maintain that it's a bilateral issue and will have to be resolved bilaterally, that there can be no third-party intervention. Is there an understanding of the import of what could happen if India opens up this whole space for third-party intervention or other countries mediating on bilateral issues?
We certainly respect that, and we respect Prime Minister Modi's position. But we want to be a good partner with India and help them resolve the issue peacefully. But we can't allow China to use it to leverage their power throughout the globe and against the United States of America. So it absolutely is a delicate circumstance. But we have to see it for what it is. This is part of what they call unrestricted warfare. And we're hopeful that the Prime Minister in India sees it for what it is as well, and will draw closer to the West, closer to free democracies and free thought and free trade, and see China for what China truly is. But we certainly respect India's. They're a sovereign nation, and they have the ability to resolve these issues bilaterally themselves. But we want to be a good partner, but make sure that India's eyes are wide open about their neighbor to the east, and I'm sure they are.
And my final leg of questions, President Trump in the recent past has many a time said that there are going to be serious actions for what China has been doing. He also spoke about sanctions and serious action after the decision on Hong Kong. Is the United States of America looking just beyond economic sanctions? Is military an option? Handling the situation militarily?
The military, one of the things that keeps that keeps your negotiation viable is the unfortunate but necessary threat of force and competent force. And the United States, obviously, that is the absolute last resort. The United States doesn't want to get into a military altercation with anyone anywhere on the globe, but it has to remain a viable option. And where the free people of Hong Kong are crying out, and we have relationships with them and agreements with them, we have to honor those commitments as well. And so, again, it's the absolute last option. We hope that we would be able to resolve the situation long before any of that occurs, but we can't allow China to just walk away from the agreements that they've made without consequences. And so it always has to be on the table always, but it is absolutely the last resort. But you can see, as you know, in recent past, the United States is willing to use it as necessary to uphold our agreements and our national security and economic security interests.
Well, in terms of the interest that India has with the United States of America, we call each other partners, and we've said that you need to move all these global supply chains out of China. India is an important market. India is an important destination as well. Where do you see the trade deal there? We've not been able to manage even a small mini trade deal between the two countries when President Trump had come visiting. Where do you see the trade deal head there?
Well, I will tell you, I think that the actions of the last 4 or 5 months, specifically with regard to China, I think that sets a new terms and highlights the necessity for like-minded and like-thinking and like-living countries to work collaboratively. And so, where there might have been impasses in the past, I think that the revelations, especially regarding China's recent actions, and of course the recent actions of China on India's border, I think informs President Modi and those negotiating, as well as in the United States, that the stakes are higher than ever, and that time is not on our side. And so we are compelled, even at times where we don't necessarily get things exactly perfect, working with democracies of like-minded individuals is much more profitable and much more productive than working with the Communist Party of China. And so we have to find a way. And so I think that those agreements and the talks of those agreements are going to be reinvigorated and carry a whole new set of circumstances of value for both India and the United States.
Well, finally, before I let you go, Congressman Perry, the 5G technology, Huawei's entry into the 5G space is a concern for all global leaders. And we've seen US, UK, all these countries come together in an initiative called the Democracies of 10, which includes G7 plus South Korea, Australia, and where do you see, and India. Where do you see this initiative head?
Well, this is an initiative of necessity. As you know, that the Chinese Communist Party has used their economic prowess to drive out all the production capability regarding 5G, and of course, their interest is in keeping with their strategy of unrestricted warfare and global dominance is to dominate the information space. And so, when they drive out all the competition, they're the only ones that are left. It's simply free countries cannot rely upon the Chinese Communist government or their equipment manufactured by Huawei to be the prime conduit for information traffic, be it sensitive information or not. And so, out of necessity, the United States is partnering with India, the G7, and other free nations to develop the technology at a scale and an affordability, not only for themselves, but for other countries that want to have the speed and the technology that G5 offers, but cannot afford the competition for China. As you know, they come in below price and literally give it almost away for free to get their foot in the door, and then they own your information system in a country. And so, to be competitive, this is what is required. It is absolutely necessary for free nations to remain free and have the ability to communicate freely without fear of interception from the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist government. So absolutely, it is absolutely overdue. The time for this is absolutely now. We cannot wait any longer, and it is an absolute necessity. So I think that there are going to be wonderful opportunities for India, Australia, South Korea, the United States, and all the G7 nations.
On that note, May, thanks for joining us here in India today.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. We really appreciate it and wish you God's blessings.